And out of that, they've probably had about 60 or so years of comparative peace and freedom. So it's very unique, that interesting of that country and that island. Cuba's early Freemasonry and its influence on independence, unlike its neighboring island of Hispaniola, which is now Dominican Republic or Haiti. As you might recall from our previous chapter, we were talking about the craft entered through French influences. I had mentioned before that Haiti was one of the first slave revolts, which happened in the late 1700s, early 1800s with Toussaint Louverture. But again, it's very tumultuous times there, and especially in Spain, considering what the Spanish and French are dealing with the slavery as well. So, and there's a lot of turmoil going on in Cuba at the same time. But the Spanish crown fears liberalism and enlightenment, which is spreading throughout their colonies. Now, the Spanish had twofold. Of course, no king or queen wants free-thinking men, but also because it's a very Catholic country, and Catholics were apparently, as we all know, were kind of forbid from doing this. But again, many of the Spanish officers at the time were Freemasons themselves. There were Masonic lodges in Spain and even in Gibraltar. But they were also kind of in secrecy. Now, the first officially chartered lodge that we know of was established in Cuba through the Grand Lodge of the United States and the Grand Orient of France. The Grand Lodges of Pennsylvania, Louisiana, and South Carolina from the United States, as well as the Grand Orient of France, all had great influence in chartering many lodges. But the first one is one that was granted around the turn of the century. I want to think about Pennsylvania, December 17th, 1804. And this is the earliest known lodge that we know of that's been chartered. And there's controversy. Some people say, sometimes you'll see it say, there's a few people that attribute this to Louisiana. However, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana didn't come into play until 1812, so it couldn't have been them. And I've been led to believe that it is the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, though there is some writings that claim that it was Louisiana, but they weren't the Grand Lodge as of yet. The English departed in 1763, and Cuba reverted back to Spain and Spanish rule, where Freemasonry had been prescribed since 1741. Spain having sided with France in the Napoleonic Wars, French Masons arrived in Cuba fleeing the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Of course, this was another Mason that led the revolution there. Many of them came to Cuba and eventually stirred up rebellion and revolution here in Cuba as well. But again, this was one of the first earliest lodges we had that was chartered in Havana, the Temple of the Theological Virtues, number 103. Interesting enough, the first master was Joseph Surnow. Now we know him to be because he is a very well-known Scottish Rite Freemason, especially during the 1800s. He has a little conflict and creates the orders, the Scottish Rite, and there's the Cyrano Supreme Council, which became strong rival to the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. And in 1867, they finally came to some accord and merged with the Northern Masonic jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. But again, that was a coincidence. He actually was living in Havana, Cuba at the time. He was a Frenchman, and there he becomes the master of this first lodge and eventually helps bring Scottish Rite into Cuba itself. But this I had no idea. I had not known about that he was actually in Cuba and lived in Cuba for quite some time. And it eventually came to the United States, to New York, to create his own Scottish Rite schism here, which happened for a short time and later was absorbed by the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. Now, the Cuban Wars of Independence, Cuba has been involved in many wars of independence, a lot of persecution by different governments, a lot of oppression by either Marxist or Soviet or socialist doctrine, or again, by Catholicism or religion. But for some accountable reason, Freemasonry appears to thrive under this persecution, in particular in Cuba. If this statement be true, then it is an ample explanation for the present status of Freemasonry in Cuba. Now, the historian Emmanuel Ribal tells us, in no place except Cuba has one seen Freemasonry exposed to such atrocious persecution as in this Catholic regime par excellence. Persecution founded on the bulls of course, Pope Clement XII and Benedict XIV, and the Edict of Cardinal Casalvi, in which all Freemasons are excommunicated and the severest punishments, including that of death, were inflicted upon them. In the span of 1868 to 1870, the number of lodges in Cuba were reduced from 30 to just 7. Many Freemasons were imprisoned, and the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Cologne was shot along with other brothers who were charged with that crime of Freemasonry. So again, Cuba has, we're getting attacked from all different parts. We're getting attacked from slavery. We're getting attacked from Spanish rule and dominion. We're getting attacked from the Catholic Church. So it's always been an incredible battle that these Freemasons in Cuba, and I guess that kind of spurred them to continue that, to empower them to continue on. And again, the power struggle between the Grand Lodges and the establishment of a governing body for higher degrees was a very difficult period for Freemasonry in Cuba. Incorporating this fact plus the same time period of fighting for independence adds another level to the tough times. However, a common theme throughout this time period and the three wars of independence in Cuba, the 10 Years' War, the Little War, and the Cuban War of Independence, the final one in 1859, is that Freemasons led the fight against the Spanish crown. That leadership began with Joaquin Infante planting the seed of independence, with Cespedes in the 10 Years' War, and Ignacio Agramonte and Antonio Maceo and Jose Marti, the apostle and the martyr of Cuban independence for the Cuban War of Independence. By the way, these are all Freemasons. Now, there was a great Masonic conspiracy, and some of these faces here are well known throughout the modern revolutionists. We start with a little bit true of Haiti. We got Simon Bolivar of South America. We got Francisco de Miranda of Venezuela, Benito Juarez of Mexico, all leaders and Masonic leaders of their own right. And again, they're all leaders and Masonic revolutionists at the time. Now, Joseph Surinao, sharing the same forward thinking as the United States, as well as in other Latin American countries during this time period of enlightenment in Americas, the first effort of independence from foreign powers was first realized in a Masonic lodge by Joaquin Infante, a prominent lawyer and a well-known author alongside other prominent Freemasons of the time in Cuba, who led an unsuccessful, but most importantly, first attempt against Spanish colonization of 1810. This was called the Great Masonic Conspiracy for Independence. He is attributed with composing Cuba's first independent constitution. Infante unfortunately never realized his dreams of an independent Cuba during his lifetime, even though he met and had established friendship with our first two Masonic liberators, Francisco de Miranda and Simon Bolivar, as we see up on top. And again, this is one of the first inkling, the first attempt at revolution early on, right after our revolution here and the one in Haiti. It is done in Cuba, and actually it was a Masonic. It was realized in a Masonic lodge. It was put together by Masonic brethren, and they came up with the first independent Cuban constitution, which later the other wars of independence absorbed and eventually became the constitution itself later in the turn of the century when it became a free and independent country finally. The uprising of 1810, again known as the Great Masonic Conspiracy, was organized at a Havana lodge. Those implicated included Roman de la Mas de la Luz, uncle of the renowned Jose de la Luz and Caballero, and Luis Braza Cardenas, who actually called on a different popular sectors such as the Black and mixed race residents of the neighborhoods of Belín, Jose Maria Barracones, and Malegal, and others to take part in this rebellion. Now, Jose Antonio Aponte is another important individual, a white Creole of a son of a colonel, worked closely with the free Black man Jose Antonio Aponte, the latter having evaded official investigations and not involved himself directly in the preparations of the plot, which set in motion a conspiracy 2 years later. And some sources point out that the street where Aponte lived located is where today the actual building of the Masonic Temple once is built over his remains, where he was actually killed and murdered. Aponte was not subjected to any trial. The island's Captain General and two other Crown officials agreed to sentence Aponte and his 7 followers to death. So he had no trial, no jury, and he was killed what would later become the site of the Great Masonic Lodge building built in Havana, Cuba. And again, he was killed on April 9th, 1812, and he died on the gallows. And he was one of the first leaders of what we call Creole or slave revolt in Cuba at the time. And this was part of that Great Masonic Conspiracy of 1810, which most of them met their fate by death, firing squad, or hanging. Or in his case, he was decapitated. Now, Cuba's had a slew of incredible speakers, Masonic leaders. All these individuals were well-known Masons from the late 1700s all the way to the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And they all had a particular point in their life where they were part of some sort of independence for the freedom of Cuba, whether it be in 1810, whether it be in the 1860s, 1870s, or 1890s, but they all played a hand. They were all Freemasons, and they were very much really focused on, and they were really in depth with this. A lot of the members that were meeting to put together these revolution matters and to try to put forth these wars and battles were all Freemasons. They would meet at Masonic lodges. They would hatch out these plans. It's something I've never seen more, other than Mexico, because there was battles in Mexico between Scottish Rite and Masons there who actually pushed for that independence as well. But Cuba is very unique in its history that every single one of these revolutions and independence were led by Freemasons. It was hatched out in Masonic lodges. It was hatched out with Masonic ideals. It was hatched out by Masonic thinking, which is very rare. I mean, we understand that, Washington and many other revolutionary leaders were Freemasons, but how much was the Masonic life actually involved in that commitment? We know that Washington only attended 9 meetings in his entire life, Masonic meetings. So did this actually formulate in a Masonic lodge? Was his thinking part of that? I mean, was he spurred on by that? But when you look at the history of Cuba, it's really incredible to see how these individuals actually played such a great part in that, where lodges actually took part, Masons actually took part. They actually sought the guidance and the leadership of these individuals that happened to there. And again, you see one of the earliest, the second battle of independence in Cuba. On the left is a picture. It's got it's got 8 individuals there. From my knowledge, every single one happened to be a member of a Masonic fraternity, a Masonic lodge in Cuba, all rounded up, or at least the 8 that are mentioned there are all Masonic brethren. And again, all these individuals had some major point in their life leading to do it. Jose Marti will become the father of the nation as Washington. Tomas Estrada Palma will become the first president of the Free Republic of Cuba. Narciso Lopez would be the one who created the Masonic Cuban flag, which we'll get into later on, and how and why it was created. So every one of these individuals played a direct hand in one of these revolutions. Now, the Cubans have had several points throughout their life where they've had remnants of independence or revolution or stirred up by a particular organization. What is an indisputable fact, and which may have more to do with this tolerance, is that the very independence of Cuba was achieved with the assistance of Cuban Freemasons on every level. Now, in 1809, the first movement in the outright independence of Cuba, led by Ramon de la Luz, was a member of the first Masonic lodge in Cuba, warranted again by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. Of greater relevance to the independence movement was his involvement in the mutual aid society originating in Nigeria and Cameroon, called Abakua, something the author fails to mention much more about, but he was definitely involved in that coup in Africa as well. What makes the presence of Freemasonry in Cuba uniquely respected is that the role it played during the 3 decades of struggle for independence from Spanish rule between 1868 and 1895. The 3 great revolutionary leaders, Jose Marti, Antonio Maceo, the father of the nation, and Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, were all Masons. Historians say today that it is the communist revolutionaries recognized and honored the Masonic affiliation of these 3 national heroes. But the truth is that little or no effort was made to repress Freemasonry. The vast majority of Cuban presidents, starting with Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, were all Freemasons as well. Now, we do have another short insurrection that happened in 1822 with Jose Francisco Lemus, with collaboration with a Colombian officer, using the subterfuge of the meetings of a Masonic lodge, Los Soles, the Sun, created by him, as procedures, the touches, signs, rituals, and hierarchies of Freemasonry. Each affiliate, or soul, before becoming lightning, had to recruit no less than 7 new followers with whom they maintained links, which somewhat compartmentalized the conspiracy. Conspiracy Rayos de Soles de Bolivar, which actually in turn would the rays of the sun's rays of Bolivar, was one of the premier attempts to achieve Cuban independence. Its name, related to El Libertador, arose from the way in which the organization was nurtured. Each member had to recruit another for whom they were granted the degree of the sun, and those who had sworn formed their ray. It adopted a flag with turquoise blue center and and at the midpoint, a bright silver sun with a crimson circumference, which we see here, and this is the individual Jose Limas. Another individual, part of us there was Jose Maria Herrera. He was part of that same group, which was a secret society with a Masonic profile formed by the Creoles who wanted the independence of Cuba. It had its beginnings again in 1823 with the Sons of the Rays of Bolivar. And again, these were individuals that were created, this order, out of the Masonic order, to form together the Creoles, to unite together the slaves, to rebel against Spain in 1823. Now, the formation of the Grand Lodge in Cuba doesn't come until 1859. It was the Grand Lodge of South Carolina that enabled the creation of the Grand Lodge of the island of Cuba on December 5th, 1859. It was then known as the Grand Lodge of Colón, in reference to Christopher Columbus, in the order to conceal its Masonic practices established on the island. The first three lodges under the newly formed Grand Lodge were La Fraternidad number 1, Prudencia number 2, and San Andres number 3, again, all being created on December 27, 1859. Now, on average, Cuba throughout at least the 1900s had an enormous amount of Masons. Today, there is at least about over 300 Masonic lodges in Cuba with almost 30,000 Masons on this little island, which stretches about 800 miles long. And I can tell you that's almost, they have about a third more Masons than we have here in New Jersey. Now, in Cuba, there have also have been many appendant bodies. We've had Royal Select Masters. The 33rd is very big. The Royal Arch is also very big there. They have the Eastern Star there. That was brought on by early on by Brother Andres Casad. But again, these are appendant bodies that we have here. They don't have too many of all the appendant bodies we have in the United States here, because we have, you know, we have about 40 or 50 different Masonic bodies and organizations here, and you really get to realize how much involvement we have when you start paying dues at the end of the year, and you realize, I think I belong to too many groups to begin with. But again, for the most part, in countries outside the world, it's the typical, either you have Commandery, you have the Scottish Rite, you have the Royal Arch, you have the Royal Select Masters, Eastern Star. For the most part, that's usually the ones they have. You may have the Red Cross and the Rosicrucians, but other than that, you don't see too many of what the Masonic bodies we have here. But the 33rd is a very powerful organization in Cuba. It is very it's very active, and probably as active on par with the Blue Lodges. The Scottish Rite is very, very active. It's always been from the 1800s, middle 1800s. So it's a very powerful organization, and they do very well, and they're very prestigious, very honored to have the Scottish Rite there in Cuba as well. Now, there is a little story about the Cuban Masonic flag, and it's crazy as it may sound, but for the third and last final Battle of Independence, which was started in 1895, for about 5 or 6 years before that, many of those leaders were here in the United States. Jose Marti, the father of the nation, actually lived in New York City in Lower Manhattan. The first president, Tomás Estrada Palma, actually was teaching in a school up in Orangeburg, New York. So they all pretty much had fled and had lived here. I know Marti lived here for about 14 years prior to him returning to initiate the final revolution, third and final revolution, which was set Cuba free. And while here, these individuals, again, affiliated with Masonic lodges, affiliated with Masonic brethren, they gained arms, they gained money, they gained support. But it's interesting enough that the Cuban flag was actually designed in June of 1849 as a Cuban national ensign, and it was made here in New York City in a rooming house on Warren Street between Church Street and College Place, which for the first time publicly flew in New York in May of 1949, and eventually it would fly over the barricades and El Caso Moro in Cuba as well. But it's amazing that it was actually started here, and it has a lot of Masonic overtones as well. We have the lady who actually designed the flag. She's considered like the Betsy Ross, Emilia Casanova Veladera. She actually designed the flag and stitched the flag together. But that was all done here in the United States and was done here in New York, and then it was taken back to Cuba for the first time and flown. Now, there are a lot of Masonic overtones to the flag, and one of the statement, if you look at the next picture, if you turn it inverted, it looks like a Masonic apron, and that's how they intended it to be. So it's the most elegant testimony of Freemasonry historical significance for Cuba is to be found in our loftiest symbol, the Cuban flag, where the Masonic ideal is concretely expressed in the red Masonic triangle placed over the 3 blue and 2 white bands, a symbol that sealed the initiate connection between Cuban independence and Freemasonry for eternity. So I didn't even realize this myself, that when you turn the flag upright, that it becomes a Masonic apron, as we see here folded. Brother Lopez was no doubt aware of the 3 oblongs in the Texas flag, as well as the flag itself being noticeably oblong. Hence, he decidedly oblong shape of the Cuban flag was more so than unusual for national flags. Brother Talon also sketched out Cuba's coat of arms, which is still there today. The Cuban flag publicly flew for the first time 1,200 miles north of Cuba, but only a short distance from where it was made. It was hoisted from the top of the floor of the New York Sun building at the corner of Nassau and Fulton Streets on May 11th, 1850, by Moses Y. Beach, no relation, the publisher of the Sun. The newspaper, in calling the attention of its readers to the strange flag, said, "High above is the flag of free Cuba. There is the flag which sooner or later will float over the Morro," the famous Castle Morro in Havana, Cuba. 8 days later, on May 19th, 1850, it flew for the first time over Cuban soil when Brother Lopez carried it as a battle flag when he landed at Cardenas, Cuba, to begin the second 10 years war of the second independence battle in Cuba. Now, the Platt Amendment is another interesting topic, because most of the members that were involved in this were Masons or would become Masons. And again, the Platt Amendment was created by Orville H. Platt, who was a member of a lodge in Connecticut. And individuals that were involved in it was William H. Taft, who his father chartered and created the Skull and Bones Club of Harvard University. I'm sorry, of Harvard University. Is it? Yeah, no, I'm sorry, it is Yale University. But again, his father created that order, and his father, Alfonso Taft, was the first member of that organization. And of course, his son and the Bushes were also members of that organization too, when they went to school there. But William Taft, again, becomes a key figure in this Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment was passed as part of a 1901 Army Appropriations Bill. It stipulated 7 conditions for withdrawal of the United States troops remaining in Cuba at the end of the Spanish-American War. And this kind of was a precursor to us having an occupation of Cuba. They wanted to not occupy Cuba. When we won the Spanish-American War, we annexed Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. That's why they were under our dominion. But Cuba, they wanted to give their independence completely too. And that was actually signed into order with this, to slowly separate ourselves from the occupation and give Cuba its independence. It's also how we gained the military installation, naval and marine installation of Guantanamo Bay, which was granted in perpetuity for the United States as long as they pay their $2,500 lease or whatever it is that they pay per month, which Castro's refused to cash any check. But again, we have Theodore Roosevelt, who fought in there, in the famous Rough Riders. He fought in Cuba. And McKinley was also a part of this legislation. One was secretary on the cabinet, and the other one was president. And McKinley, and Taft was actually a secretary at the time while this was being signed. So all these individuals had Masonic connections to this organization and to this actual dealing with giving Cuba its final independence and separating ourselves from a occupation force in Cuba. The other one was the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment was an amendment to a joint resolution of the United States Congress enacted in April 20th, 1898. In reply to President William McKinley's war message, it placed a condition on the United States military presence in Cuba. According to the clause, the United States could not annex Cuba, but only leave control of the island to its people. In short, the U.S. would help Cuba gain independence and then withdraw all its troops from its country. And this was again named after Henry M. Teller. Henry M. Teller was also was crowned the first sovereign grand inspector general for Colorado in 1882 and served in that capacity for 32 years. And he was also most worshipful Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Colorado on 2 occasions. In 1863, he was the 3rd Grand Master appointed, And then he went on to hold that position from 1867 to 1872. And in a statement, he writes, "I can never do better than now when the American flag has come down from Cuba. But better still, a flag for Cuba has gone up. The American flag is the best flag in the world for Americans. It is not the best flag for men who do not want it. It is not the best flag for Cuba. Cuba's flag, not representing 100th part of the power of the glory of ours, is the flag for Cuba. And when the Filipinos shall put up their flag and ours shall come down, as I believe it will someday, it will be a better flag for them than ours can be. Although you may administer your government with all the kindness and all the wisdom of which human beings are capable, the blessed flag is that flag that the men themselves put up. It is the only flag that ought to command the admiration and love and affection of the men who live under it, and it is the only flag that will. Liberty-loving men will never have any love for a flag that they do not create and that they do not defend." And again, William McKinley also had a part in the Teller Amendment, and he states in his political atmosphere of the U.S. growing out of the Cuban struggle for independence, and following on February 15th, 1898, the sinking of the U.S. Maine, remember the Maine in Havana Harbor, President William McKinley on April 11th, 1898, asked Congress to authorize and empower the president to take measures to secure a full and final termination of hostilities between the government of Spain and the people of Cuba, and to ensure in the island the establishment of a stable government capable of maintaining order and observing its international obligations, ensuring peace and tranquility and the security of its citizens as well as our own, and to use the military and naval forces of the United States as may be necessary for these purposes. Now, William McKinley has a special interest in Masonry. He is a military officer for the Union during the Civil War, and there's a particular story of how he actually became a Mason. While they had occupied, they had won a battle, and he had visited a camp that was loaded with Confederate soldiers who were wounded, and he brought his own surgeon from his own company with him to see if he could render aid to these individuals who were hurt. Now, his surgeon was a Mason, and while they were walking around together, every now and then, the surgeon would bend over, grab this Confederate soldier's hand, make some sort of gesture, whisper in his ear, and on some occasions actually give them money. And throughout this whole time, he's witnessing it. Doesn't do it to everybody, but just particular individuals. Now, he doesn't grasp what's going on really, but the doctor, being a Mason, is addressing other Masons who are apparently giving the sign of distress or advising that they are Masons. They're showing a sign. And the doctor is helping and aiding these individuals best he can. And on some occasions, he gives them, these soldiers, these brother Masons on the other side of the battle line, whatever money he can to help them out. And after it was all over, William McKinley finds this intriguing. He's like, it's got to be something going on here. And he had to ask his surgeon, he goes, "Did you know any of these men? Because I seen from time to time you would talk to some, you would shake their hands, you would cover up, it seemed like you were very intimate with these individuals. And on some occasions, you gave them money." And he turns around and he goes, "No, I didn't know any of these men." And he goes, "Well, I don't get it." I said, "It seemed like, you had some connection with these men." He goes, "Well, they were brother Masons. And I'm a mother Mason, and I was only doing what a brother Mason's obligation to do is to help a poor and distressed brother Mason in need." And he mentioned, he goes, "Well, but on some occasions, you gave some money." He goes, "Well, some were in need of money, and I gave what I could, the length of my cable toe." And McKinley asked him, he goes, "Well, do you ever expect to get paid back?" He goes, "If they can, they will. But if not, then I have done my Masonic obligation and duty to give so far as my cable toe will allow on that particular moment to aid another brother's help, regardless of the uniform or regardless if he's on the opposing side." And apparently the statement that McKinley uttered afterwards, to his surgeon, was, "If that's Freemasonry, then I think I'll take a slice for it myself." And he went on to become a Freemason, and probably one of the most ardent, most, active Freemason. He just loved everything about Freemason, including dressing up with Washington's regalia that he used for the cornerstone laying of the U.S. Capitol. So that's an interesting story. And again, this whole topic goes to influence, and that's a main point which we'll get to at the end. Now, the big interest is, how the heck did Freemasonry survive in a Marxist Soviet dictatorship in Cuba? With these Masons. Now, most people don't realize that if you see in the top left-hand picture, Fidel Castro's first attempt was in 1953, which was called the 26th of July movement, which is still a big day in Cuba. It was a Cuban vanguard revolutionary organization and later a political party led by Fidel Castro. The movement's name commemorates its 26th of July 1953 attack on the army barracks of Santiago de Cuba in an attempt to start the overthrow of dictator Fulgencio Batista. Of course, this was quickly, this insurrection was quickly put down, and eventually he was arrested, he was charged and tried, he was later exiled to Mexico, where there he would spend the next, about 15 years or so planning and hatching his plan to come back on board the Granma. But again, Cuba is a particular interest to Masons because Cuba is one of the few nations where Freemasonry was proscribed by its Spanish colonial power for centuries. But with the introduction of a Marxist communist dictatorship, Freemasonry has been permitted to operate. A small lodge in the Sierra Maestra is credited as having hidden Fidel Castro in 1958 on his landing from the Cuban shores on his ship named Granma. A building in a remote village in the Sierra Maestra, the door, Masonic symbols, and square and compasses, where it is said that in 1956 hid Fidel Castro, who had just landed from his ship on his second attempt to foster insurrection and revolution in Cuba. It was precisely within the old mountain lodge that future Maxim leader has created the 26th of July movement that in a few years would sweep away the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, inspired by the teachings of Jose Marti, the hero of the Cuban father of independence movement on the island. So of course, there's been many rumors as to why and how Masonry has survived, where religion hasn't survived, where liberties haven't survived. How did this survive all that time, where in no communist or socialist country does Freemasonry exist and has survived as it did in Cuba? Of course, there are many stories told in Havana, including the tolerance of Fidel towards Freemasonry is due to his affection for his teacher, who was a Mason. That Father Angel, famous landowner, was affiliated with Freemasonry. It is a gesture of respect to his friend Salvador Alandiante, also a Mason from Chile. Even some right-wing theories, of which the internet has unfortunately more than its share claim, that Fidel, or at least his brother, Raul, were initiates. There is no proof that him or his brother have ever been, ever were or made Masons or were part of the organization or the fraternity. Might have well been, but they've kept that mighty quiet if they were. So there are many rumors and stories, but the most prevalent one is that he comes back for his second attempt at revolution and overthrowing the governor Batista, and early in the mid-50s. And there he runs into some problems. He runs into some issues as they're kind of overrun, and he has to go in hiding in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And it's said there that a Masonic lodge and Brother Masons offer him safe haven and protect him until he can regroup and again try for the second time, which actually led the revolution and actually succeeded. So those are some of the stories that have circulated, and that is supposedly the unwritten rule why Freemasonry has survived for so long during a communist, socialist, or Marxist regime in a country like Cuba. Now, during Cuba's long-standing history of independence, Freemason and Masonic lodges fulfilled three key functions, allowing them to survive for over 200 years through countless imperial rule and occupation. Now, this is another reason why people think that the Cuban government, even though it was Soviet, a socialist or Marxist or communist, kind of absorbed and kind of allowed Freemasonry to happen, besides all the rumors that he was a Freemason or that he was hid in a house, in a Masonic lodge and protected. But most scholars believe that the real importance is that through their involvement, Masonic lodges, Cubans interested in autonomy or independence, the two roles leading to social economic development, were able to meet, exchange, and enrich their ideas and create parallel organizations to implement them. Spanish authorities recognized and feared such bonding and nurturing catalytic effect. Thence, as independents participated peacefully and otherwise on both sides. Many revolutionaries were themselves or had family and friends who were Masons. Thence, the new government was well aware of the institution's relevant and long involvement in Cuba's struggles for civic life. We propose that Castro's government recognition of the Grand Lodge of Cuba historical role was influential in permitting the Grand Lodge of Cuba to continue operating after 1960. Another important reason why the Grand Lodge of Cuba functioned without government interference was advanced by past Grand Master Pinero de Cueto in his 1971 report to the Conference of Grand Masters of North America. Because of their desire of the war started, Spaniards closed lodges in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. Similarly, during the 1959 revolution that brought Castro to power, many Cuban Masons participated peacefully and otherwise on both sides. Many revolutionaries were themselves or had family and friends who were Masons. Thus, the new government was well aware of the institution's relevant and long involvement in Cuba's struggle and civic life. And again, I believe that one of the main reasons that Castro was a smart guy. He was, I mean, I know he oppressed a lot of people and many people were forced to leave, but he was a smart guy. He knew the power of politicking. He knew the power of orations and speeches, and he also knew the power of the history of Cuba. He tried to align himself with the great revolutionary leaders of Cuba, the ones we had mentioned previously before. But again, all those had one thing in common. Besides being revolutionaries, they were all Freemasons. These plans were all hatched in Masonic lodges, and they had an incredible support of Freemasons and the lodges in Cuba. So it would behoove him to actually go against the grain and try to knock that down, because he realized that the people were for revolution, the people were for independence, well, people were for Masons, and knew that the history of these Masons, who they were. There wasn't a single president or famous revolutionary leader in Cuba that wasn't a Freemason. So I believe that that in itself was the primary reason. I mean, I know there's a lot of other stories and a lot of other great myths that we like to believe that he was, you know, he was nurtured and he was harbored, safe harbor, and given a safe, you know, protection. But I believe really that Castro knew the power of the historical significance of Cuba's independent revolutionary leaders, and he fed off that to entice the people. The people loved all these leaders. They loved Jose Marti, Antonio Maceo. They loved these guys. So there's no way he could actually go against them, because at every single time the Catholic Church went against them, the Spanish went against them, the English, every time somebody went against these individuals, the Masons got up, stood together, and forced revolution and forced independence, which eventually happened in 1898. So he realized that he was going to go against the grain. So why not absorb them? I'm going to keep control of them. I'm not going to get them too out of control. I'm not going to let them grow out of, you know, out of my visual eye. But I believe that his mantra was, if I don't know what's going on, so be it, which was a stance he didn't take on many other groups in Cuba. Most all the other fraternal organizations were completely, you know, eliminated. Religion was eliminated. The Catholic Church was eliminated. So again, I think that he realized that the power of these individuals, that from a long-standing history, even though he did not approve of America and many other of the modern revolutions that happened, granting freedom and democracy, he realized the power that the Masons had behind these scenes, and feared that if he went against them and wiped them out and forbid them from meeting, that they again would rise up as they did over the last 200 years, and again rise up against him. So he says, if I'm going to be able to have a role and continue in this position, I'm going to need their support. So I'm not going to let them get out of control. I'm not going to let them be out in the public eye. I'll let them have their little businesses. I'll let them have their little meetings on the ground. Do what you got to do. As long as I don't know about it, I ain't going to say nothing about it. No one's going to mess with you. That's my guarantee. And that was something that, you know, it may have not been written, but Masons were not, for the most part, bothered or attacked or hunted down at any time. That was something that, you know, Castro really did not impose any type of restrictions on them, except just keep a low profile and stay on the cover and don't be flamboyant and in the public eye as they are now. But I believe that's the true, I think the true reason why I think that Castro realized the power of Masonry, the power of these individuals, and the power of the history that was behind that. And he couldn't go against history. He had to align himself with that history in order to continue his reign going forward. He couldn't go against those great leaders who were the fathers of the nation, and they just happen to all be Masons. So I believe that's the true, actual meaning of and and the true actual explanation as to why Cuba has Masons have been able to do what they do for such a long time and still do today. Now again, there's many unsupported stories of how the organization was protected and how they sheltered and protected Castro. Again, this being the little lodge where he was from. But if you understand Cuban Masonry, in a Masonic lodge in Cuba, the right of the chain of union or force represented by the crossed hands and arms crossed of the brethren is symbolic of the evident unity and power of Masonry. The brotherhood is hoping to play an important role in the future of the country. So this is where it came from. This is where the strives and the hardships and the plans were hatched to eventually free Cuba on many different times and in many different parts throughout their over 200-year history. So again, I think that's what he was fighting. He was fighting that chain of union. He was fighting that brotherhood that he could not go against. These were the same guys that had been here every single time, and on every occasion, they have always won. Somehow or another, they've always come back and eventually won. So that was something he was going against that he could not do. And again, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was the largest trading partner with Cuba, the Cuban government has further facilitated things with Masonry, permitting it to participate in public ceremonies and opening new lodges. However, the smooth functioning of all the Masonic lodges is still subject to permission from the authorities, and the publication of books and pamphlets is quite limited for Masonic groups, due as much or more to financial limitation as opposed to government regulations. Now, the government, the Grand Lodge of Cuba, which is in Havana, which is a beautiful building I'll show you later, that building is an enormous building. It was a magnificent piece of art that was built. But again, during the communist years, more than half of the building was taken by the government and had their government offices there. They had many, to this day, when I went to visit, they still had, had at least 8 floors that belonged to the government. And that was a way of giving back a little bit. So they had to give back a few floors. A lot of the lodge rooms had to be taken up and space had to be given to them. The Grand Lodge room, the main lodges, the museum and library, that's all, he didn't touch that. That was never touched. It was a lot of offices. They used to have a small hospital there. They had a small home for elderly Masons. So most of that was actually taken by the government. The main parts of the building that was for Masonry were not touched, and they were allowed to actually have on their side. But the one thing that stands out now, is it patriotism or is it conspiracy when you deal with Freemasonry in Cuba? And it could be depending on which side you're on. If you're on the Spanish side, if you're on the French side, if you're on the English side, if you're on the Catholic side, you could be a patriot or you could be a conspirator. The one thing which stands out in all of the history of Cuban Freemasonry is the persecution which the brethren of that had to undergo as a result of their belief. Changes have been made that these brethren conspired against the government, did not allow for American brethren conspire against the English government in the early history of our country. Do we condemn them for having so conspired? Washington, one of the chief conspirators, has become the father of our country, honored and respected because he stood loyal to the ideal. Shall we condemn these early Cuban patriots for doing the same thing? To fully express what Freemasonry represents for us in a few words, suffice to say that without mentioning it once, twice, and perhaps 1,000 times, one cannot write the history of Cuban culture or Cuban struggle for freedom without Freemasonry. We should honor and remember these brave men of Cuba who inspired by their Masonic beliefs of freedom and equality for all men, never strayed from their ideals and following the paths of so many revolutionary leaders and fellow Masons who fought for freedom and who carried out their Masonic ideals in doing so. Now, brethren, this is the current Grand Line of the Grand Lodge of Cuba. They are flourishing. Of course, they're in need of funds. They're in need of money. A couple of years ago, Most Worshipful Grand Master of New York, William Thomas, went and he brought the Grand Master, not the predecessor before this one, he brought him over to New York. He went and visited him in Cuba. Our Grand Master from 2018 here in New Jersey, Right Worshipful Quintana, which I'll show you later, also met with the Grand Masters and have begun relationships and recognition. So most of the countries and states around the world are now recognizing again Cuba, but they are incredibly headstrong and steadfast in their commitment to Masonry, and including, this is the new Grand Master, Ernesto Zamora Fernandez. He is the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Cuba in a long line, and they do serve 3-year terms. This individual on the left with me in New York, at the Grand Lodge building in New York, was the previous Grand Master, Lazaro Faustino Cuesta Valdez of Cuba. And he came, the current Grand Master showed up last year. We invited him here to New Jersey, Ernesto Zamora Fernandez, and he joined us in one of the lodges here. This Sons of Liberty Lodge was primarily founded here in the Grand Lodge of New Jersey by Cuban men who had left Cuba, men who were of Cuban descent. And that was one of the first lodges made of predominantly Spanish men here in the Grand Lodge of New Jersey, which was done back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Now, just to give you an idea, when we met Grand Master Lazaro, one of his biggest issues he had was that his brethren didn't have enough ties, they didn't have enough aprons to go around. So at a moment of friendship and brotherly love, the 100 or so brethren that were there at this meeting and fellowship coalition we had afterwards, we all took our ties and we gave them to the Grand Master. And you see me here, and my tie, my favorite tie, one of my favorite ties I love, that I was more than happy to give it to him. And then we pledged support and money so that they can buy Masonic regalia, so that the brethren can dress properly, because they really, really take Masonry to heart. And of course, the restrictions and the hardships that Cuba's endured, these brethren have endured, has been hard, but they still keep that to heart. I mean, they try to do their best. They try to dress properly. They try to buy the right regalia. So to this day, I still send from time to time, I send packages down there with aprons and all kinds of stuff so that the brethren can be spread throughout the island. And many jurisdictions have done the same as well. But again, that was a nice touching fitting when over 100 brothers took off their ties, their cufflinks, their tie clips, and and I mean, the Grand Master walked out with an armful of ties and stuff. It was amazing. I mean, you could see the tears in his eyes from the love and the brotherhood. Now, I'm just going to briefly show you some pictures of my travels when I went to Cuba last year. I had never visited my parents' country until last year. The brother on the right, Brother Masons, Victor, is a good dear friend of mine. He actually came to Rochester, New York, to watch me to see me get coronated at 33rd degree. And believe it or not, the Masonic Museum and Library in this grand building is magnificent. There's the great giant marble statue of the father of the Cuban country, Jose Marti, Brother Mason. He's the one that lived in New York City for quite time. But during that time, up until Castro, they really revered and admired American Freemasons and American famous people, including there were statues of Abraham Lincoln, there was busts of George Washington, there was busts of many famous Americans, which as you walk down down the hall to the monument here of Jose Marti, and this is his actual apron regalia that he used, his regalia for the Scottish Rite that he actually used in his apron. On each side there's a bust, and over half of those busts are Americans. There are American in the Freemasons who were looked up to by the Cuban people for their spirit, their persistence, and their quest to liberate themselves and become free. Now, and to the top left-hand corner are the Grand Lodge office. That's the Grand Secretary, the Grand Treasurer, and some of the individuals that staff that work in the building. Again, they're in need of money. They're in need of repairs and supplies. It's hard to come by. But the Grand Lodge building in Cuba, in its heyday, was probably one of the magnificent buildings in all of Latin America. It was really a beautiful building. The globe with the square and compass rises to the top, and for the longest time, it was the second tallest building in Havana, Cuba, in all of Cuba, actually. As you see here, we're standing on the roof of the building, which you can actually go out to and see the city of Havana and all Havana from the top. And you can see here the panoramic shot, as I was taking a shot from the top of the Grand Lodge building, like I said, which is one of the tallest, which at that time, in its heyday, was the second tallest building. And the picture on top is the old cathedral of Havana, which dates back to the early 1500s when it was built. It's a beautiful plaza. It's a very old section of downtown, or Old Havana as it's called, but a very beautiful and majestic scenery in place there, almost like a European type feeling when you walk through there. I did have the pleasure of when I took the cruise, the brethren of Cuba, Victor, called me up on the phone and said, "Listen, don't purchase any tours on the ship. Don't buy nothing." He goes, "They're too expensive." He goes, "Listen, we're going to take you wherever you want to go." But I had told him that I was at a party of 9 co-workers, which we usually travel together every year. And I said, I don't want to burden you with taking all these people. I said, you know, we're all together, and I don't want to leave them. He goes, no, no, no. He goes, we'll rent the van and we'll take everybody. If there's 9 of you, we'll take you, fine, no problem. I got a van that'll hold everybody. And at the end, we gave the driver, we each kicked in $125 and gave the driver and them a tip for taking us all day. But we were there for 36 hours and they had us for every hour of the day. And here I made it to the famous Floridita bar where Ernest Hemingway is the actual bust, a bronze bust of him in the corner where he always stood and drank his famous daiquiri where it was invented. This is the famous bar where the daiquiri was created and invented, as many drinks in Cuba were invented here. But it's a beautiful, magnificent building. Again, there's some pictures here. One on the top right is the Bodeguita del Medio, which is the second most famous bar in Cuba. And it's famous also because maybe famous scholars and artists visited it. And then you get to write your name on the wall and everybody just writes over it, which we all did. The bottom pictures show the house of Ernest Hemingway in outskirts of Cuba. And this is the office where Ernest Hemingway wrote some of his greatest novels during his lifetime. The house is as it was when he first died. He was he had a great love for Cuba and Havana and the people and the history of Cuba and spent a great part of his life there in Havana, Cuba. Of course, it wouldn't be the same if we don't go to the Tropicana. And it was an incredible show. I must say that it's sad that you know, times are a little hard again, but it seemed like Cuba was beginning to open up a little bit, and they were spending money and they were receiving money. And this show, the Tropicana Club, is what it was. I mean, I heard this was, in its heyday, it was the place to be. It was the Pearl of the Antilles. It was the playpen of the Caribbean for many Americans. But I tell you, the shows they put on there that night was incredible. And again, they had the front row table for us right in the front. They hosted us, and it was incredible. And they didn't never ask for a dime. And just to give you an idea, the cruise wanted $400 for me and my wife to attend this 4-hour dinner and show alone for 4 hours. And we spent 36 hours, including the 4-hour show, throughout the entire island of Cuba, and never asked for a dime. As I said, we gave them all about $1,500 or more towards as a gift and a tip for them for doing what they did. But it's incredible that even there you still find the fellowship and the brotherhood and the love of them willing to just open up their hearts, even though they don't have much, they really don't have much to offer, but whatever they had, they were willing to give you 100%. These are some other famous places: the Havana Club, the company where it makes the famous rum from Cuba. The top picture on the right is the Plaza of la Revolucion, which predates Castro. It has nothing to do with Castro. It was built there with the bust of the biggest statue of Jose Marti, the father of the Cuban nation. You see the panoramic shop. That is probably one of the tallest, I believe it's the tallest building. You can actually go up to the top, tallest structure in Havana. It's a very beautiful plaza, and it's a huge plaza. And here is where they would bring out all the military procession and stuff like that, which later turned Soviet. I mean, it turned communist and turned socialist. But again, this predates Castro. This was built in honor of the 1895 revolution. And of course, the right-hand picture is the picture of the Capitol in Cuba, which has been just about completely retrofitted and refurbished, and it will open again, and the session will be held again of the Cuban Parliament. And that was based off the designs of our own U.S. Capitol to a smaller version. But that is the fascination and the love that the Cuban people have with America, and that they always had, that they wanted everything American, and they wanted the Capitol. They wanted to build a spitting image of the U.S. Capitol, smaller and scale it down to size. And probably one of the best surprises he gave me is when he told us on our last day, we had about 7 hours on our final day. And he said, when you come outside at 8 o'clock, meet me there. And when I came out, to my surprise, he had a string of old cars, which people are known, Havana is known for its all these beautiful old cars, which are, it seems like Havana's been frozen in time from 1959. And he actually hired the oldest taxi vehicle in the taxi fleet. This is a 1921 Ford. It is the oldest vehicle licensed as a taxi in the city of Havana. It's in perfect running condition. And me and my nephew just had a great time. And he had 3 cars. There was 3 of them all rented for all of us. And he said, this one's just for you and one other person, your nephew. And they took us all over Havana again with a beautiful day out, smoking cigars, enjoying the beautiful, warm, sunny weather and incredible blue sky. So that was a real treasure. I'll never forget them having to do that. Well, brethren, I will turn it over to you now. As I say, as I said before, I believe that the most important thing we get out of Cuba and Masonry itself is influence. It's influence, it's trust, it's fellowship. Many people have been influenced, and last night I did a lecture for the Brethren of Nova Scotia, and we said how Prince Hall and many of these individuals could be influenced into helping and doing a good cause, regardless what the cause was. And I believe that's what actually inspired the Cuban people to it was the influence of what Masonry stood for, what it had done, and what it previously done. And I believe that's why Castro would not go against that influence, that history, that was so intertwined with the people of Cuba. That Masonry was, in fact, part of that nation. It was part of the people. It was there on every step of the way, fighting for the rights. Sometimes they didn't win, but again, they always were there fighting for democracy, for the freedom for all, for civil rights for all. And I believe that's the true beauty of what's kept Freemasonry alive in Cuba, and the fact that no matter what communist or socialist country you go to, you will not see what has happened in Cuba there anywhere else. Not in Russia, not in the Eastern Bloc countries of Europe, not in North Korea or in China or in Vietnam. What happened in Cuba was very unique, and I believe it's because of the strong Masonic ties that it's had to its history, intertwined together. I believe the Cuban history is part of the Masonic experiment. It is the Masonic, controversy. It is the Masonic quest for independence and freedom for all. And I believe that is what inspired them. And I know for a fact, I believe that that's why Castro would never, ever turn against that, because he knew by turning against that would be doing the same thing the Spanish and the English and many other organizations did that spurred these individuals to rise up and rebel when the call came. And it just wasn't beneficial for him to do that. Of course, he wanted to keep them controlled a little bit and keep them on the ground. But again, I think that was the real reason why he actually did that and went forward. But brethren, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Again, it is my first time, so I'm learning as you are. May God bless all of you. May God bless the United States of America. May God bless all our Freemasons all around the world. And tonight, particularly our Cuban Freemasons, where they are, may God shine their blessings on them and keep them strong and healthy, and keep them, focusing forward. And may God bless the greatest fraternity in the world, Freemasonry. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Moses. I said at the beginning that this would be fascinating, and it absolutely is. Again, let's think about this. 30,000 Masons, 300 lodges. That's more than we got in Washington. I think that's almost 3 times the number of Masons and twice the number of lodges. That absolutely amazes. That absolutely amazes me. I got to point this out. You had mentioned Juan Aponte, and of course we have David Aponte on the screen. And I asked David Aponte relation. And David, would you be so kind as to share with me what your grandfather said?
I belong to 2 families, Aponte and Sejo, and they just told me once you're an Aponte, that means it doesn't matter what color you are; it's the same tree. So, and I do want to say that that part I did not know. I know that there was Apontes in Cuba, but I did like your talk on Freemasonry in Cuba. There's one curious thing. Now that you mentioned the flag, and I'm just going to touch on 2 things. The triangle, it is red because of the influence of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite in Cuba, number 1. And number 2, the triangle does mean liberty, fraternity, and equality, which are the 3 basic things that also came from France via the Española. Okay. With regards to that, even though the flag was created in New York City, okay, it was Venezuelan general that had the conception of that, and we cannot take out the whole Freemasonry in terms of the Latin American revolutionary independence out of this, because the majority of them were Masons. and they were very influenced in terms of those three words, from Bolivar all the way up. And even Puerto Rico, if you look at the flag of Puerto Rico and Cuba, they're the same, but reverse colors.
Yes, absolutely.
But basically the same principles. And that was because the Masons in Puerto Rico was also involved in liberating Puerto Rico from Spain. Another interesting fact that I do have to tell you is with Fidel Castro, the church did survive in Cuba under very strict regulations, However, it did survive just as Freemasonry. Number one, because Fidel was educated in a Catholic school. Okay, he was a Marista. A professor that I had, he taught Fidel, and that was the stories that I got from him about who Fidel Castro was. And Fidel Castro was just a nationalist until he met Che Guevara in the Sierra Maestra.
Right.
And Che Guevara was the one that began taking him away, but he never left truly what he read about Martí, his ideals, etc. And one of the things, even if you have to say, Fidel was a very learned person, a lawyer who defended himself when he was captured at La Moncada over there in Santiago de Cuba. And he always read everything from all positions. And that's why he was the person that he was, that he knew how to control. He knew what buttons to touch,
right,
and to maintain his power. Okay. Even when Russia fell and left Cuba, he still wanted to go, to exercise, and he kept himself in power for so many years. Okay, it's 68 years that the revolution has been in Cuba. And now you have seen Fidel die. His brother is almost next in line to pass away also. So it is an incredible individual. And I think the line that you brought, that he did not want to cause any more revolution against him from the people, he played it safe. He played the nationalistic card and emphasized Martí, but he tried to mix Martí with the Marxist-Leninist principles. Another influence with that, and in terms of the Catholic Church, if you remember, there was a priest in Nicaragua who was also Marxist and was another influence on Fidel. And that's why the church, remained with the restriction that it had, but it did remain within there. So I thank you for what you brought on Freemason in Cuba. And I do have to tell you, I do have a CD or a DVD that was given to me by the Grand Lodge of Cuba when they celebrated the anniversary of Jose Martí.
Okay.
And I think this was in 2006 or 2007, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you very much.
No, my pleasure, Brother Dave. And like I said, you are true. The Cuban flag was inspired also by the Chilean flag,
Mm-hmm.
which was then inspired by the Texans. The flag of Texas, which is very similar, was inspired as well by that. And then came the Cubans and then the Puerto Ricans. So they all had Masonic. They were all created by Masons. They were all had Masonic overtones and ties because of that. Even the Lone Star State flag of Texas. So it's very amazing to see that. And Cuba, here in the United States, had, I forget the name of it, but there was a group that were meeting secretly, a group of Masons meeting secretly to, again, fight for the independence of Puerto Rico as well as they were doing in Cuba. So Cuba had a big hand, and that's why they chose that flag just to change the color, because you couldn't have two flags representing two different nations. So they just perverted it. Ours is red and Puerto Rico's blue, the triangle. Mm-hmm. And that's how it was actually came to be as the Puerto Rican flag again, through the Masonic contacts and networks of those trying to liberate that country. So it's very poignant how they all worked hand by hand, and they
were all Masons.
Yeah, no, they were all. There's definitely. I mean, it wasn't like half and maybe a third. No, in Cuba, these guys were, everyone that was involved in this was Freemasons, and then they came here to New York, and they associated with Freemasons. They went to meetings, they had fellowship, they raised money, they raised support. But again, it's the influence. They were all in awe of the American Revolution, of the French Revolution. They were really, really, mesmerized by that. And I think that Masonic influence plays a big part in how people can change for the better or change these people into these causes. And I believe that plays a big hand in that. They were all definitely influenced by the meaning. We spoke about this yesterday when I spoke to the brother in Nova Scotia, that probably the key most important part is influence. I think influence, seeing Brother Mason act and do the right thing, being educated and being able to educate others, definitely plays and leaves a mark on these young men that come into our craft, as they are influenced themselves by the good of these men who are there now.
I have to tell you, Moses, that when I told David that you were coming in, what you were talking about, he was very excited about that, about being part of this, about being part of tonight, and I think you can see why.
Absolutely.
So, David, I thank you. I thank you for that added insight. That's fantastic. Just want to see if there's any other questions for Right Worshipful Brother Moses. I do want to point out that it is 11:11 over in his neck of the woods. So
I'm good on that. I know some of the brother in Canada, it's 12 o'clock now, but I'm good here.
Let's see, Very Worshipful Brother Don Downing, what do you have?
I'm interested to know if you know of many of the other lodges in the Caribbean down there. I know my wife and I took a cruise, and we happened across a lodge in one of the Caribbean islands. I also ran across one in Mexico. So it's kind of neat how many, if you know.
Brother Don, I believe you muted yourself.
I wanted to know if you knew of any other lodges in the Caribbean and that could be visited.
Oh, I just about every other lodge. I've been physically, I'm a member of a Scottish lodge in Bermuda. I visited and spoken, and I visited Bahamas, Aruba, but just about all the Barbados, Trinidad, all these nations have Jamaica. They all have lodges. A lot of them don't have grand lodges, like for instance, Bahamas and Bermuda. They do have the 3 working jurisdictions, Irish, Scottish, and English, and they don't have a governing grand body, as does Bahamas as well. Aruba belongs to the Grand Lodge of the Netherlands, as well as Bonaire and Curacao. But yeah, almost every island in the Caribbean has Mason. Prince Hall came from Barbados. That's where he was born. So there's a lot of working lodges. Cuba was the only one that was kind of under restriction because visiting because of communist and socialist Marxist regime. But again, they did flourish underground, and they had some struggles, but there's no problem with the other lodges. I mean, there's many, the Virgin Islands have lodges, Puerto Rico has lodges. Puerto Rico has an independent Grand Lodge. It's the 52nd. We have 50 states plus the District of Columbia, which makes 51 jurisdictions here. Puerto Rico is the 52nd jurisdiction. They have their own Grand Lodge, but yeah, many are under English, Irish, French, Dutch, or Scottish constitutional lodges. But yeah, there's plenty. There's no shortage of lodges there, and the fellowship is incredible in the Caribbean nations and the islands. As small as they are, they're incredible to visit, and when you get there, they just whenever I go, they just really go out of their way to make you feel at home, and you'll never feel unwanted in those islands. But yeah, any island you go to is most likely a definite open lodge ready to accept you.
And very much, sir, we do have representatives from Trinidad with us here tonight. So
I think it's Paul Court, I believe, or
Lloyd Cowie and Sheldon Tate.
Oh yes, Cowie. How you doing, brother?
Good, great, brother Moses.
Good to see you, my brother.
We also have Prince Hall lodges in Trinidad, Barbados, St. Lucia, I believe Antigua as well.
Yeah. Like I said, there's no shortage of lodges that are in the Caribbean. There's plenty.
And at a minimum, very worshipful, you could say that you got to sit in a Zoom lodge meeting with brethren from Trinidad. So that's awesome.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, we had plenty last night from Nova Scotia. We had plenty from the Caribbean as well. So it's
I believe you have a brother from Jamaica as well.
We do.
I'm here.
There we go.
There we go.
That's awesome. Very much Brother Ryan Leonard, I see your hand up.
Yes, I just have first, Moises, I want to thank you for this presentation. It's fascinating to learn that Masonry in Cuba is doing as well as it is, especially under the regime that's in place down there. My question, and I guess this can be answered by either yourself or Most Worshipful Brother Jim. The Grand Lodge of Cuba extend any fraternal relations here anywhere in the state?
Well, I know New York was one of the first to reconcile and recognize. New Jersey did with 2018 with our Grand Master, who happened to be the first Cuban-born, first Hispanic Grand Master in the Grand Lodge of New Jersey in its entire history since 1787. So he was eager, and his trip was to Cuba. Every year, Grand Master takes a trip, and his trip was to Cuba. So he was eagerly awaiting for that, to have that done. I believe Florida had done, and I think they got pulled back. But there are jurisdictions that have come in. I don't know about Washington, but I know many are slowly but surely jumping on again, as they were before, pre-Castro, pre-59, as they were.
And Washington does recognize Cuba. Worship of the Dantes Lahens is the Grand Rep to Cuba.
Okay.
So very, very, very excited about that. There's actually, I can't remember it, but if in our proceedings there, the grand historian at the time, and I'll have to look it up quickly, actually did his grand historian's report on Freemasonry in Cuba. So I'm gonna, while David, if you would take over monitoring questions, David Colbeth, I'm gonna quickly see if I can find that report.
Happy to get it. Actually, I've got a question myself, or maybe a rolling question and a statement about as in our ritual and the installation, it talks about that, or it requires the master to promise that he won't be concerned in plots and conspiracies against the government, and to patiently submit to the law and constituted authorities. And so your comment about the revolution and about the conspiracies in Cuba, as well as in the United States and its formation, is a totally interesting topic. And I would invite you to maybe our deputy, as he takes over, and whoever he can find, to maybe find someone or find a small group, 2 or 3 people, that could talk in depth about that part of the code, if you will, or the part of the ritual that says that, and the promises that we make as Masons, that you're not supposed to be part of that overthrow or that conspiracy. It's interesting intertwinings of Masonry and our commitment to government.
Well, as a matter of fact, last night when I spoke on the civil rights, and I spoke at the Underground Railroad for Nova Scotia, that topic did come up. As a brother said, we're supposed to keep the peace and harmony of the lodge, and we're not supposed to be involved. But I do believe that, yes, as a Mason, you should honor and respect the laws of the land or government or jurisdiction you belong to. However, when at that moment it becomes necessary because of the disruption of the peace and harmony of civil society or the community, all those Masons involved, and I believe that they should stand up and do what is right and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, or fight for those who are trying to oppress them. And just like we can say in a lodge, if there's a ruly brother in a lodge who's disturbing the peace and harmony, should we not say something? Should the master not stand up and put an end to that at that moment there? So I believe that there is a fine line. I don't believe you should conspire to go against nations and countries and laws to do wrong. But when you're talking about keeping people oppressed, denying people their civil liberties and civil rights, keeping people in bondage or in slavery, I believe that, including our own Washington and many here who would have been looked upon as Tories, would have been probably hung if we were lost the war, because they were seditious acts. But again, I think that a Mason has to draw the line and say, at one point, you do have to get involved. And I always preach that if you see a wrong or a crime or something wrong being committed and you do nothing about it, you're just as guilty as the person committing that wrong or that crime. So you are now becoming an accomplice to some wrong or evil in there. And I believe the moral virtues that Masonry teaches us, and really the core value, is that we are all the same, that we are all equal, and that we all deserve that right to meet in fellowship. I may not agree with you, I may not like you sometimes, but I have to respect you, and that's the order of the day. And when that is being threatened, then I think Masons should stand up, as they've done for centuries around the world, as they've stood up for those causes, to stand up when peoples are being oppressed, including themselves. I mean, there was many men of color in Cuba that were being oppressed. There were many slaves. There were many Creoles. So yeah, I believe that that you do have the right, and you do. Even in our own Constitution here in the United States, if you read the Declaration of Independence, there's a small caption in there that says that when it becomes necessary for the American people to rise up against a tyrannical government who is now imposing harm or oppression on their people, that it is the duty-bound right of each citizen to stand up and get rid of that government and start from scratch. And that's probably the single most beautiful document and wording you can ever find anywhere in the world, that it allows you to rip up what we got now and start right if it's not what is doing good for the people. And I believe, just like our Declaration of Independence and Constitution advises us to do, I believe in a Masonic Lodge, it advises us to do the same exact thing, that as long as we keep the peace and harmony and all could be treated equally, then again, that's right. And just like your past Grand Master from 1898 said, I shall not rest until all Masons respect and receive each other as brothers. Don't ever mark my grave. And he's probably still not at rest, poor guy, from over 100 years ago. But again, that's the mentality. I think that is the greatest gift that our fraternity offers the world, that these men can exchange information, can exchange ideas and say, hey, this is not working out. It's not good. It's wrong. We need to step up and do something. And it's sad that Masons don't talk about that more. You know, we talk about the myths and the treasures and all this other nonsense. We don't talk about what these men actually did, what they put themselves through. They were willing to give up their lives, their fortunes, their families, because of that greater good, because of that higher calling of God and laws of nature, the laws of man, and the laws of government and Masons, to stand up and do that right thing. And I believe, yes, I think you shouldn't be a rebel rouser, but I think when the time comes, yes, every Mason should stand up. And just imagine if none of them did. If Prince Hall didn't do what he did, if the Prince Hall brothers didn't do what they did, if the Cubans and Americans and French didn't do it, Italians didn't do what they did, where would we be today? If we were all still in that same bubble saying, oh, you know what, I'm not gonna do nothing. I'm just gonna sit back and keep my mouth shut. Again, some of us do, and some of us take that leap forward, and that's hoping what I'm doing. I'm hoping I'm bringing this powerful lesson of influence and morality and doing the right thing when it comes to it. And just like that brother who came to me and said, when I gave the Underground Rebel lecture, and said to me, you know, you changed me. For years, I always knew it was wrong what these people were doing, but yet I wouldn't say anything about it. So guess what? You became an instrument. You became, by your silence, you became a part of that conspiracy. You became a part of that mentality. And I never forget the words when he told me, he goes, if you've never changed anybody else, know you've changed me. So from now on, I may not affect change, but I will voice my opinion. I will do what is right every time. And when someone is blackballed because of the color of their skin or the faith they believe in, I will surely stand up, because that's not what Freemasonry is intended to be. It is intended to open the doors for all men to respect each other and to meet. And as you saw in this powerful presentation, you see that these men met in lodges, and what kind of discussions they must have been having in those lodges where they were formulating these ideas, creating the first constitutions, creating the first amendments, all based on the influence of what they were influenced by our revolution. Again, Masons here influenced Masons in Cuba, and they took it a step further and initiated cause and effect. They failed sometimes, but they kept going until they finally reached their independence.
So I found the article. It was actually written by a member of Walter F. Meyer Lodge of Research. I put the link into the chat. I encourage you to download it and read it. Where's Brother Steve Daisy? It's Steve Daisy. I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say the tradition to not discuss politics in the lodge actually comes from England, and where it originated was in the 1800s, when you saw Masons involved in Europe and in Austria and Italy, and also in South America, involved in the revolutions. And Masonic lodges were being banned in Austria and in some of the other countries. The Grand Master of England, Ugly, wrote a letter to the Crown, attesting to the Crown that Masons would never involve themselves in politics. And that tradition kind of grew out of that letter to the Crown in England and was transferred over to the US. So what you have is American or U.S. lodges, Grand Lodges, having almost universally been an outgrowth from England, Ireland, and they've adopted that tradition, whereas the lodges in Europe, famously in Italy, but also in Austria, and then the lodges in South America were very much involved in the idea that Mo was putting out, is that they had a duty to fight for the liberty and the equality of all mankind. So I thought it was very interesting that, that dichotomy, to where English lodges, because of that letter from the Grand Master to the Crown, that, hey, we're not going to do this. We're not going to be involved in politics. Rest assured, you don't have to ban Masonry in England. But Masons elsewhere took a little bit different tact in what they felt and what they believed.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that even in 1840, the Freemasons Hall in the Great Hall in London, England, which the building still stands today, they hosted the first World Conference of Abolitionism to end slavery around the world. And the Grand Master, the Duke of Sussex, gave that the final keynote speech and remarks of that 3 or 4 day session. So again, he was breaking his own rules, because he was engaging in rhetoric and engaging in going against the rule of the day, was slavery was allowed, it was legal, but yet he was actually proposing this abolitionist movement. And many of the individuals that put that together were Freemasons. So, and like in South Africa, in 1973, when the two lodges, the White Grand Lodge of Africa and the Prince Hall came together, and they initiated Black Men 1977. I believe in what they were seeing was something wrong. That we want to meet with each other, but we can't, because the laws of the country would put us in jail if we did the mixing of the races. But yet they took that step. They said, you know what, if we don't start here, it'll never start. So we have to start here. It may not have been the entire cause of the fall of apartheid, but there's no doubt in my mind that when those Prince Hall Freemasons left and demitted from their jurisdiction amicably and joined the White Grand Lodge of South Africa through the entire process to become full 100% members, admitting them into their lodge, I think that was a small step in breaking down that barrier and that wall of oppression and hatred and segregation and slavery and apartheid. No doubt about it, that it was probably the first step where white men and Black men came together. And where did it happen? In a Masonic lodge, because in their hearts, they knew it was wrong. And if it works in a lodge, it should work everywhere outside the lodge as well.
Is there Brother Perry? Please unmute yourself.
Brother Moses, phenomenal program tonight again. The last one last night was phenomenal. This one is on par as well. My question is that I really believe this type of education is imperative for us to be able to go forward and actually serve the membership. Now, is there a place I can go to in regards to find out what kind of additional lectures, presentations that you have, so that we can see about expanding this much more, because it's just been phenomenal these last 2 nights.
Actually, sure. I think we just became Facebook friends, I think today, if I recall. So do you do Facebook Messenger?
Yes, I do.
All right. You know what? I'm going to put my information up. Brother Jim, would you mind putting my email and mobile number, if you have it, on the chat room, and let everybody have it? And
I don't. I can put it in the chat. I just don't have it handy.
Okay, hold on. Let me. I'll do
David Colbeth. While he's doing that, would you please find the link to the District 13 YouTube page?
Absolutely. It's very simple. youtube.district13masons.org, but I'll type it into the chat.
That'd be fantastic. Because we record all of these. And we've been doing these. We haven't recorded all, I shouldn't say all, we record most of them, but we've been doing these since, about May or June, when we realized that we were going to be kind of COVIDed down, and how we were going to get together and share education. And we've been fortunate to be able to get some incredible speakers to come share with us on a wide variety of topics, both Masonic and non-Masonic. So that's a good place. That's another good place to start. And it looks like Moses's email address is on the screen. So if anybody wants to find out when he's appearing next, because I know that he's in high demand.
Put my mobile number and my email there, and you're free to contact me anytime. If your jurisdiction or your lodge or you want something, by all means, I'll if I'm available, I'll do it. I have no problems.
Yeah. There are a couple, and I know and we thank you, by the way, Moses, for allowing us to record you, because we've had the pleasure of having some other, what I will call, just like you, a high-end speaker, and they've said, yeah, please don't. And that's kind of a bummer, because, you know, that kind of stops the audience. And, you know, I get it, but come on, there's brethren who want to have some sort of interface, and
Absolutely.
this is and it's been valuable. So again, we've called on Moses 3 times, my brothers, and he has never failed to respond. Topics that he shared with us, and it's just absolutely amazing. And Mo, I just can't thank you enough. And we're hopeful that the timing will be right, that we'll be able to make a field trip out to New Jersey. What we're doing the math. It sounds like 2024, somewhere in that time frame. I mean, we're not campaigning. Well, it doesn't matter. No one's listening to us anyway. But
well, if everything goes right, I hate to say running, because I don't like to campaign against any other brother, but I'm going for the South in New Jersey. When you become Grand Master, you bid for the Junior Grand Warden, and if you're elected, it's an automatic progression to the East 4 years. So in November of 2022, my name will be in the ballot. And if the brethren so choose, right now I'm the only one. If they so choose to vote me, I will become Grand Master in November of 2025. So that's the date. If I am elected, that's the day I would like to have you all there.
That brings up a funny story. When I was Deputy Grand Master, we had the Deputy of District 4 wrote a song about me, and he sang it at the fellowship meeting, and the line was, "So Jim Mendoza, you're the favorite son, but I looked at the ballot, you're the only one."
Well, I hope that I can sing that song. If I'm the only one, I'm going to sing that song myself.
It was pretty funny. I can't let this moment go by. We have the Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Nova Scotia here. Right Worshipful Sir, would you unmute your mic and share a little something?
Again, this has been a wonderful evening. And Brother Gomez, thanks a million. This is the 3rd time I've listened to you over the last little while, and each night has been tremendous. And I just like to add this thought. Sometimes we stop and wonder, should I say anything? Should I speak? And sometimes we say no. But I think probably I've got a phrase here that old fellow that I knew a long, long time ago used to say to me when I was a young whip behind the ears guy coming through university. And he used to always look at me and say, the time is always right to do what is right.
Absolutely.
And, for me, that has been a sort of a guiding principle for a long, long time. And I think probably that it is just as valid today as it ever was, probably more so. But it's been a tremendous evening. I thank you all for having me. And I thank you, especially Brother Gomez, for another very inspiring evening. And my brothers, keep safe and be well.
Thank you, Right Worshipful Sir.
Thank you, my brother.
Wow.
It's funny you should say that, because this is the slide I always use at the end of one of my PowerPoint presentations. The time is always right to do it is right.
Yeah.
And I always use that as my last slide of the Underground Railroad lecture, because it really touches home what that means. And
I had an old prof used to use that same one way back in the early 60s. So I'm not dating myself or anything like that. But
so I want to just find out: is there anyone else that has a question for Moses at all? I'm going to. Moses, again, Right Worshipful, thank you so very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. I still remember the first time I met you. It was at Verity Lodge. You came out to Kent and to share with us your 9/11 experience. And for those brethren who have not heard his 9/11 talk, this is a man who was boots on the ground at 9/11. And it's one thing for folks like us who watched it on TV, who saw who saw things, but I've had the privilege of talking to two brethren who are quote unquote boots on the ground. Number one, the the junior past Grandmaster of the Grand Lodge of Newfoundland, who shared with us what happened when all the planes landed in Gander.
Gander, yeah.
And then, of course, Right Worship Brother Moses, and I can't forget also, this was kind of a tangential thing, but it's still there. Most Worship Brother Carl Fitchie, his son was one of the firefighters who ran into the buildings and never came out.
Yes.
So when you hear these boots, it's one thing to watch it on TV, but when you hear from brethren like Moses about their boots on the ground stories, it really drives the point home as to what these brethren do. Looks like our brother from Trinidad does have something for you, right, Merciful Sir? So I'll give him a chance.
Sure.
Thank you, moderator, Brother Mendoza. Brother Moses, I was very touched about the fact that they are still struggling in Cuba, because I was there in 2008, not for Masonic business. We went there for sports. And I got the opportunity to visit the lodge because one of the Masons, a Cuban doctor in Trinidad, was able to ask his wife to take me to the lodge. And she escorted me to the lodge door, and the outer guard gave me admission. Well, they expected me, and I got admission. And regalia were in tatters. They had a large chest with the regalia, and it was in tatters. And the only people who wore regalia were the master and the two wardens. And the temple we went to, many of the brethren were sitting on the floor around the senior warden and junior warden's pedestals. I had been a past master already. So I sat in the east, and they allocated a brother to sit with me and translate everything that took place at the meeting. And when the secretary read the minutes at the end of the meeting, he translated as the secretary wrote. And it was very impressive.
Incredible.
So it's interesting that it still need regalia.
Yeah, unfortunately, the times are still tough there, and it's still rough for some of the brethren, and it's they're in need. I know the New Jersey and New York have sent quite a bit of supplies over time, so we send them usually white aprons, and like I said, that one night when we met the Grand Master here, everybody took their ties off, and if you had cufflinks and tie clip, you just gave it. So I mean, he walked away. I think he had to buy another suitcase just for the amount of ties he collected on his trip here in aprons. But again, we've shipped from time to time. We'll ship down, or I'll collect some money or raise money, or if I get honorariums, I have various charities, and sometimes I'll send money to them to the Grand Lodge to let them use it as they see fit, or I'll buy aprons and send them aprons. Sometimes it's a little bit cheaper to buy it for them and ship it than them have to buy it directly from somewhere else and ship it into Cuba. It costs them more money if I just buy it myself here and put it in a box and ship it. So every little bit helps. Every little thing we do can help another brother in need, and that's what we're here for. It's our charity, and not just our charity for ourselves, but and for charities for wonderful organizations. But I think the most important charity in Masonry is the charity to do good to others, even if they're not Masons. And I think that's the most important charity. And I think that's what all these leaders, inspired them to do that. That the greatest charity we have is to have charity, to do good towards all, especially when those are in times of oppression or people's rights are being violated, or civil rights being violated. I think that's the greatest charity that Masonry offers, that we can see beyond all that. And unfortunately, we are a wonderful, perfect institution made up of many imperfect men. Like every organization, there are men that choose to do wrong, and there are men that choose to do the right path. I mean, Masonry opens the door and says, here are the tools, better yourself, do better. If you choose to do that wrong, then that's up to you. But it's not like there's no 100% bad policemen, firemen, lawyers, doctors. It's individuals who choose to do wrong, and we should never lump the entire group because of one man's or one woman's desire to do wrong. In our fraternity, we've had bad men in our fraternity, and there were many men that had slaves and owned slaves. But again, that's not the majority. It's those individuals who choose to do the wrong thing with masonry and not take masonry to cradle what it's worth and do right with it. And again, it's not masonry that's bad. It's those particular moments. It's those particular times. When Medgar Evers was shot by a brother Mason, it wasn't masonry that was bad. It was that individual who went against his moral compass, went against his moral beliefs, and doing the right thing.
He remained a rough ashlar.
And he never changed. He never changed. He must have had a dull chisel because it never it never changed. And well, let me tell you, there's been a lot of many dull chisels. It's not the only one, but again, that's why I believe it's in, you know, brother, if you asked before, I believe that's why Masons should stand up because there are many Masons that are doing wrong. And like the Right Worshipful Deputy Grand Master said, if you don't do right, and if you don't stand up and say and keep your mouth shut, then that wrong continues, and that in turn will disrupt the peace and harmony of a lodge, which we're all duty bound to obey and respect. So again, you should. I believe you should stand up and you should voice your opinion.
Thank you.
Again, I want to thank Right Worshipful Brother Moses for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, brethren. I'll be sending a link to. I'll be sending the link to this recording to Very Worshipful Brother David Colbeth, and he'll do his magic, and he'll have it uploaded. I forgot to push a record until after the first slide was completed, so I missed the intro. But guess what? We got 95% of it, so that's great.
No problem, brother. I'm sure. I have a funny feeling someone from Nova Scotia is going to be asking me to do this lecture very soon.
I have a reason to do that. Again, Mo, thank you so very much.